Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for having me. My name is Jesse Sanders, and I'm actually from Denver, Colorado with a company called Breebug. I'm here today to talk to you about NgRx and complex forms. This is a talk I gave at NgConf, and well, we're going to run through it a little bit quicker today, but should be entertaining and hopefully very informative for you. So really the purpose of this talk is to get to serenity. So handling complex forms with NgRx and eliminating some of the headaches and heartaches that are going on. So who out there has like a session service that starts out innocently enough? It's got maybe 30 lines of code in it, right? And then all of a sudden before we know it, we see it, it's got like 600 lines of code. It's this mess. It's got a header at the top that says, do not touch. Please contact Jesse before touching any of this. This will break production. So that's really the idea of this talk, is to talk about some of the concepts that we can do to eliminate those sorts of things, because forms are hard. You know, not only do we have to get the data displayed, we got to validate it, we got to make sure that it's being displayed correctly, we're showing validation messages, and we need to be able to save it. And some forms, when they start out, fairly easy, it's really not that big of a deal. But when we start having relationships between objects, and we're going to talk today about an order with line items and products, and it starts to get a little bit more complex. And especially then when we look at how do we do this with NgRx, as we're trying to simplify our applications and make things easier, the thing that we run into is that there's not a lot of examples of how to do NgRx with forms and what are the best practices there. So my hope here is at the end of this talk that you be able to look at this information and go like, you know what, I think I can find some serenity. I think I can find some peace of mind in my approach and have a consistent way of handling forms. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a really simple concept called container presentation. This used to be called smart components and dumb components. So the idea here is that we have a container. The containers are responsible for deciding how things work. They're the ones that interact with the store, and then they're going to handle any sort of events that are being bubbled back up. So they're dispatching actions, they're using selectors to get data from the store, and then they're using inputs to pass them down. So if you look at our HTML up there, via our input here, we're passing down the customer via an async pipe, and we're handling any click events that are coming back out. So my presentation component is only concerned about making things look beautiful and making no decisions. It doesn't understand what happens, doesn't know where the data comes from. All of a sudden, poof, it just gets some data, and my job is to render it and then not worry about where it comes from or whatnot. And then when anybody clicks on anything, that I don't make any decisions either. I go ahead and send that back up to my parent container, and now allow it to go ahead and make the decision on what we're going to do with it. So one of the other things that makes our lives a lot easier when dealing with forms, and especially dealing with complex forms, is NgRx Entity. Is anybody using NgRx Entity right now? Nobody? Couple? All right. So NgRx Entity was released this past October by the NgRx team, and really the concept here is to get away from using array-based data in our stores and starting to work towards using dictionary data. So this actually comes from the Redux.js org spec on how to normalize our client-side data. What we really see here, when we start to talk about relational data, we have orders and customers that have line items and products, is we start to see people nest data. And so we'll go ahead, it's really simple. I get my orders, I'm going to go ahead and attach my customers to it. I'm going to go ahead and attach my line items to it, and then attach the products to that. It makes it really easy. I don't have to go run anything down. It's already in a nice consumable format. And people will go ahead and start building applications this way, and then somewhere, usually around 70% of the application being done, they start to realize that there's some new problems. And one problem that occurs here is that I'll go in and I'll make a change to a product, and I might change just the price on the product. And it changes it in this one spot here, but other places that are displaying product aren't getting that update. And it's because I have multiple copies of the same exact data all over my entire application. And it's not just me. It's also all the other developers that have touched this and have started nesting and burying this data, and becomes very, very nasty. So that's one of the really big problems. The other one is my reducers go from being really nice one-line reducers to being 50 lines of really difficult to test and difficult to maintain code that's managing my state. So that's another really good indicator that we've started to create a problem. The other thing that happens that a lot of people aren't aware of is that because of our objects in the store are immutable, if I want to change an item, let's say I want to change the product price or the name, well, what's going to happen there? I'm going to have an orders component, I'm going to have a line items component and a product component. And what's going to happen is when I update that, it's going to force all of them to re-render. If I don't do that, then I've mutated my data and my store is completely hosed and whatnot. So it's causing these it's forcing the re-renders of all these components. In some cases, that's not that big of a deal, but in most cases, it's going to cause some major performance issues with your application. So the number one thing that they come back and say is do not nest your data. So NgRx Entity is your tool for helping you to avoid nesting data. So the spec for NgRx says really you're going to have two properties now. Instead of having an array of objects, we're going to have a single object and it's going to have two properties. One property is IDs and the other property is entities. So the IDs is a list of the IDs for the natural order of how it came back, typically from our API or whatever sorting mechanism we've used. And then the entities is our dictionary. So whatever our unique key is, typically our ID, that is going to be our key, and then our value is going to be our object. So what this allows us to do is be able to get the entities object and then ask for something by ID. And what the NgRx entity library does, it actually places items into this dictionary for us by the ID. We can specify that if we need to, specifically if it's not just ID, if it's underscore or whatever we're using for a unique key. It'll go ahead and insert it into our dictionary for us. The other thing that the entity library does with the adapter, and the adapter is really the one that does all the heavy lifting, is that it provides 4 selectors that allow it to pull the data back out. And so we don't have to write a whole bunch of selectors to try to figure out how do I get the data in and out of this dictionary. So, because obviously dictionaries don't work so much with the ng4 directive, right? It wants an array to iterate over. Great. So those are some of the fundamentals, and just by using container presentation and using NgRx Entity, those will actually help you simplify your forms a lot. The other thing I didn't say about the nested data, when we look at these here, instead of nesting them, what we really want to do is take and have an order store, a customer store, a line item store, and a product store. And they are top-level citizens, first-class citizens within our store. So they're not nested. We can create relationships between them using their IDs and be able to use selectors to grab those and display them, but they're not nested together, and we eliminate a lot of those problems. So one of the first problems that we're going to attack today really quick is how do we deal with viewing complex data? So when we're talking about a form like this here, where I've got an order, a customer, a total, and the total really is, if you think about it, that's my line item quantity times by my product price. And then I need to take each one of those values and sum them, right, so that I can get a total here. So when we first thought about this, it's like, this is going to be easy, right? We're going to enumerate over some stuff, we're going to select, we're going to calculate, it's going to be great. But that actually wasn't true. Selectors don't have parameters. So it's no way that I can just enumerate over, shove in an ID, get a value back, and that's really not an NgRx way of doing things. So our first pass, we were a little frustrated. We're like, all right, this doesn't really work so nice. So at our second pass, we started to realize, okay, look, a couple things that we didn't really think about is we've got 4 different streams that are coming in, and they're coming in at disparate times. We don't really know when they're going to. Oh, Cache Killer. It always likes to tell me in the middle of a presentation that it is automatically disabled. All right, so these 4 streams come in, and they come in at disparate times. We don't know when they're actually going to arrive. So one of the first things we need to do is combine latest and get those down to a single stream. When we initially did this, the approach that we used, actually I went too far. The approach that we used, we created a new model. And that model then had the order with the customers attached to it, with the line items and the products. And we're like, okay, let's build it this way. And we just enumerated over it and started attaching stuff to this temporary model. And that didn't work so hot either. because in our container we are doing enumeration and we pass it down to the client, we're enumerating back over it again to do the calculations. So what we ultimately settled with, and the recommendation here, is that when we get our single stream, go ahead and enumerate it over it, perform our calculations, and store exactly what it is that we want to display. So that we do it one time, we can pass this dumb data now down to the client, or down to the presentation component, and the presentation component can just render it. It doesn't have to enumerate over it, doesn't have to think about it. It's already calculated and we're good to go. Otherwise, serenity. So by doing this approach, we found that it was a lot easier than us trying to enumerate over things and trying to figure out how we get this to work. And so that seemed like a really good approach for us. So that's great, except for the problem is that rarely does my job entail just displaying data. I have to be able to display data and edit data, update it, and validate it, whatnot. So let's talk a little bit, another fundamental here around like form basics. And with form basics, we have our container, we have our presentation component, and again, we're taking our input and we're passing it down to the presentation component, but the difference now is we're creating a form group. And with this form group, we're going to watch for NG changes, and we're going to take the values that come in on the input and we're going to patch those onto the form. And then any sort of value changes that occur on that form, we're going to go ahead and output them on an emit event, and we're going to then push those back up to the container and store those in a local variable. Now you don't have to do it that way. You could go ahead and push it directly into the store, but the problem is if the user clicks cancel, then your store is updated and you've got a new problem. You've got to try to figure out how we're going to resolve that and roll it back to whatever state I want it to be at. So we usually like to use a local variable, and when they click save, then we're going to use that local variable to push the data up to our store, and then whatever action then is going to handle that to push that on up to our API. So if we look at this product form here, so it's pretty simple. It's two parts. We've got our product with the save and the cancel. That's really our container. And then our presentation component is the form that contains the two properties there, one for product name and one for product price. So that is our presentation. It receives the product down as an input, and when any sort of changes occur, we're taking those and we're kicking them back up to the container. When they click save on the container, then it's going to decide how we're going to interact there. So when we look at the container init, as we said earlier, containers are responsible for dispatching to go load data, and then using selectors to get the data so we can then feed that down to our presentation components. So in our case here, it's pretty simple. We're going to dispatch our load product. This is a pretty simple example, but usually what I would use is the router store to get that ID off of there, but this makes it a little clearer in this demo here for you guys to see and understand. The product, we have this product $. I usually like to postpend my variables there for observables with $, because we're going to actually have two products. One is going to be just a regular product of type product, and this is a product of type observable. But here we're piping our store select, and we're getting our selected product. So that's how we're pulling it back out of the store. And then on the container events, we want to watch for when the product changes. When it does, here's our second variable. We're going to go ahead and set our product, which again is just a unwrapped, non-observable, and we're going to grab the value variable that has product on it. And then the other thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and set a valid property to know whether or not it's valid. There's a couple different ways to do this. This is just one approach. But what we like to do is go ahead and pass that valid back out so we know that whether or not the form's valid and whether or not we should allow it to attempt to save and send that up to the server. So on the presentation, like I said earlier, we've got our form group, we've got a couple of inputs, and we have one output. So our inputs are for our products, and another one called show errors. I usually don't like to show validation until they've clicked a save button or whatnot, and so once they've clicked save, I'll set show errors, and then we'll show validation and whatnot. So, and then on the output, any sort of product change, we want to be able to emit that back up. We want to emit the product and whether or not it's valid or not. And as you see here, we've got actually that code is old. The private alive has actually been replaced with observable for whether or not we kill this, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But on our constructor, we build our form. The build form here should look pretty familiar. This is just a standard form builder group. We're setting our two properties, name and price. Notice we're not setting any default values. We're just applying our validators to those. And then on our form group value changes, we're going to take while. Again, this actually, this slide needs to be updated, but we're going to take values while this alive. We're going to skip the first one because that's actually when we first pass down the data to the presentation component. We want to skip that one, and we just want to debounce on 500 milliseconds so they're not getting every single change as you're typing. We're going to go ahead and subscribe to that, and then we're going to go ahead and fire our product change emit and go ahead and send that information back up. So that means the users type something, change something, and we want to go ahead and send that back up to the container. NgOnChanges is going to watch for the changes to the inputs. If we have changes to the product and it has a current value, then we're going to go ahead and patch the value onto the product. Okay. So again, just to kind of reiterate here with the form basics, we have our container, we're passing things down via inputs, our presentation component receives that, it's creating a form group, it's using default, no default values on it, adding the validators, it's patching the values when the inputs change, and any sort of changes to those values, we're subscribing to those, we're debouncing it, we're skipping the first one, and we're sending those back up to a local variable. So let's take a look at a little bit of code here because, like I said, we updated a couple things on this, and I wanted to show you. The container's pretty much the same, but if we look at the product form, a couple of changes that we did here. So it was funny, I was sitting there, it was about 10 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden I get a message from Ward Bell. I'll give a plug to Ward. Hey Ward, how you doing? And Ward's like, hey, did you know that this won't actually do what you think it's going to do? So we looked it up, and yeah, he was actually right. So we added this new variable called private destroyed, which is just a subject. And on the destroying of the component here, we're just calling the next and then completing that subject. So down here, actually, let's get this out of the way. The one change here is we're taking our value changes, and we're taking until this is destroyed. So take while, unfortunately, wouldn't always fire, and so we're actually leaving an open subscription, and we had a memory leak. And so this is a common technique that we're starting to see more and more of. Other than that, it's exactly the same. We're emitting our product and our valid back up, so pretty simple there. All right, so what we found is by applying these techniques to a simple form, it actually was really, really easy. That we didn't have a whole lot of issues with how we put this together. It made our lives very, very simple, and we were able to save that data and work with it very easily. So that's great, but that doesn't actually really describe this presentation or what we typically as developers do every single day. What we're more apt to be doing and what we're exposed to is complex forms, things that are much more complicated. We've got nested data, we've got a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to figure out how do we get these things to work. The good news is this, is that it actually, if we apply the same principles, it works the same exact way. So if you understand how to do basic forms, you'll easily be able to figure out how to do complex forms. With this order form here, we've got a customer up at the top, we've got line items here with the products, we've got our pricing. Actually, if we come over on this side and let's go edit and see a live one here. I got an order summary at the bottom that's giving me my total. So it's not an overly complicated form, but this is a lot more complicated than just doing a master detail and edits. And so what we ended up here, we have our overall form group, then we have one to handle the customer. We have, actually the customer is attached to that overall form group, and then we had a line items. And that form group is actually of type array. And inside of there, each one of these lines here for each product that's been selected is in that form group array, and it's its own form group, right? So this should be a fairly standard technique that you've seen in other applications that you've done, or examples that you've seen about how to do one-to-many sort of validation here. Let's come back over here. All right, so now what? Let's actually take a look at a little bit of the code that goes with this. And open that back up. Containers. Nope, not product. Orders. How are we doing? That went blank. All right, we got a few minutes left here. So when we look at our container, it's basically doing the same thing as the product one is, except for this time we're dispatching for multiples. Now again, with this sample code here, we're just using a JSON server, so we don't actually really have a real API, and I'm not able to go, hey, just get me the customers with this order, just get me the line items for this order. Obviously in a real application, that's really what we'd want to have it do. So in our case, we're loading a bunch of different data and just getting all of it and bringing it back. And the two things you see here is we're watching for line items change and for the order change, and also for the validation change. Also here, we've got our save. It's a little bit more complicated. We're checking all of our validation, making sure that we're valid, and then displaying a message that order must have at least one line item if it's not. Otherwise, in our case here, we're only doing, well, actually this is for the edit, and then we've got our add order here. So we're taking our line items in our order and repackaging that up and sending it out. So that's pretty standard there. On the components for this, you can see we've got a lot of different components. We've got the order form itself. Actually, let's take a look at how we're passing this down. So we've got our app order form here. We're passing down the orders, the customers, line items, and products down, and then we're watching for our changes on line items change, order change, and the validation change. So closing that up. Okay, we got just about a minute here before we can take a couple of questions. Joe, you said I could go long though, right? Yeah. So you see here on our components, we've got our order form, we've got our order detail, our order summary, our orders table, our line items table, actually that one's part of it, and then the customer. So we've got lots of different components, and basically if we look at the order form here, it's really probably the last piece that we'll get into. We've got our app customer. This is wiring up our customer, our line items. Here's our order summary. So we're just cascading this information down. So, but in essence, it's working the same exact way as what I showed you on the product form. It's very, very simple. We create our form groups, we watch for value changes, we emit those back up, and then we allow the overall order form to decide what's going to happen. So if we follow that container presentation model, it really does make it very simple. And then we apply our form basics. It really works. So let me just kind of, one other item that I didn't talk about. One of the other foundation concepts here is that cloning is a good idea. So when we're doing our selectors out of our database, or out of our store, we want to go ahead and clone that data so we make sure that we're not accidentally mutating that and having it affect the store inadvertently. So cloning is definitely a good idea. So to kind of wrap this up, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal here is NgRx can help us simplify our applications and help make our lives a lot easier instead of having lots of race conditions going on about when data's coming and going, as well as having a massive session service that makes our lives difficult. We can use NgRx with these form basics and container presentation to really help limit the complexity in our apps and make our lives a lot easier. And really, hopefully that gets us to Serenity. So with that, that's pretty much everything for me. We'll just kick through that. No, we're not going there. We do architecture reviews, customized training, Angular consulting. You can reach me at jesses_Breebug. Please follow me and hit me up.